Good morning, everybody. Hey there, Sebastian. How's it going? Yeah, there's about 3 minutes until class starts, so I'm just kind of setting up the stream. Good to see you guys. Hope you all had a good weekend, and yeah, we'll be ready to go in just a few. Hi, Leo. How's it going? Hey, Alessandro, Stephanie. Good morning to you guys. Hey, Naaman. Hi, Sophia. Welcome back. Good morning. Hi, Mia. Hi, Janice. Hello, Allison. Welcome back. Just a couple minutes for us. Pretty good, Brandon. Yeah. Hi, Sergio. It's getting a little warmer finally, so I'm happy about that. Hi, Celine. Hey there, Malia. Hi, Kevin. Hope you guys slept pretty good. Good morning. Welcome back. Hi, Brittany, Katan, Alexis. Thank you guys for being here. Okay, just another minute. Just looking for my kitty over here, Eddie, running around. Eddie, Peachy. Hello, everyone. Hi, Sheely, Jason, Melanie. Welcome back. Paula, Nathan. Hey there, Angel. Kate, good to see you. Okay, everybody. Well, I'm going to let it get started because we're now at 10 a.m. So thanks again, everyone, for attending and for being here today. We have a pretty straightforward plan for the meeting. It's all on schedule in terms of the class calendar of dates. If you look at the syllabus, we're right on track. So today we're going to start talking about a new topic in the semester. We're moving on from philosophy of religion into the next big topic of the class. Hi, Angel. So where you'll submit the essay, you're just going to submit it to me as an email, send it to my email as an attached file. So there's no such thing as Canvas, and there's no such thing as sending it through Titanium. You just have to compose an email, type in rvulich@fullerton.edu, and then attach your file to the email. That's all. But yes, it's not due until next week, as you know. It's due on Thursday, March 4th. So yeah, you can email it to me anytime prior to 10 a.m. on Thursday, March 4th, and that'll be an on-time submission. So you still have a good amount of time to work on it. Yeah, good thing to ask about. So the first essay, as you guys should know, is due next Thursday. By now, you've got all the notes that you might want for the paper because we finished all the philosophy of religion material. And anybody who's working on a draft or who would like to have any kind of comment or feedback from me, I'm always happy to do that. You can email me a draft if you want, but if it comes in very late in the game, like Tuesday night of next week, then it might be a little too late for me to get comments back. Nonetheless, I try my best, and it's just an option for anyone that wants to take it if they do. But okay, so So that's just one thing to look forward to is the essay due next week. And then after that, if you look ahead a little bit further, the midterm is on the 18th of March. That's week 8. So we still have a while before, oh no, sorry, it's March 23rd. Midterm review is March 18th. Week 9, Tuesday the 23rd, that's the exam. So we still have a little time until that, but for now we're focused on the first paper. Okay, and thanks everyone for being here. If you have not yet, make sure to just place a comment in the chat. That's what I'll do to keep tabs on attendance overall throughout the semester. Okay, so good. Let's just jump right back into our meeting. So like I said, I think way back in the beginning of the class, there's a lot of different specialties within philosophy and more focused areas of research. Just like in science, a person doesn't say they're majoring in science. A person says they're majoring in biology or chemistry or physics, a specialization within the broad field of science, okay? So philosophy is kind of like that. There's a number of different topics. One of them is philosophy of religion, which we've now learned a bit about. But there are others, and we'll cover what I think are some of the biggest and most important. Today we start in on the second major topic of this semester, which is ethics. Okay, so we're going to spend a couple of weeks on this, and this is our second big subject matter, ethics. Now, the word ethics probably is a word, I mean, I know that we talked about it at least briefly one earlier time when we discussed W.K. Clifford's paper called The Ethics of Belief. But now we're going to have a little bit more of a focused study on this topic for a sustained period of time, a couple of weeks. So ethics, what is ethics? It is the theoretical study of morality and moral concepts. Okay, so the study of morality and moral concepts, that's ethics. Okay, and so what I want to do here below, this is the definition of ethics basically, and I want us to try and list, if we can, what are some different examples of moral concepts. So let's get into this, guys. Let me know in the chat what words pop up in your head when you are told to think of ethics or morality. What are some buzzwords that come to mind? You know, since you have at least some sense of the concept of ethics and morality, let's see what you can tell me. Sorry, we got like one person that's trying to troll, but I was able to remove that person. Okay, good and bad, right and wrong. Things like that, morally right and wrong. Right versus wrong, good versus bad, exactly. So pairs of morally contrasted concepts. These are kind of like binary opposites having to do with morality. Sometimes we look at a person's action and we judge it on either of these bases, saying that it was wrong, or on the other hand, that it was good. Sometimes you're the subject of other people's moral judgment, and sometimes you're the moral judge of either other people's behavior or even your own, right? So sometimes a person does something, and a person is like, that was terrible, that was wrong, shame on the person for doing that. It could be individual behavior, it could be a practice or an institution that someone condemns morally. And in the other case, maybe someone praises an action that was done. Like, you know, credit to you for doing the right thing, or you did the right action, the good action. So good, bad, right, wrong. Let's see. I see some other things up there. Ethos, empathy. Yes, those are like virtues and qualities that have to do with being a moral person. Anything else in the same kind of mix here? Think of like a pair of contrasts, like this versus that, where one is on like the positive side of the moral scale, and then the other person is on the bad side of the moral scale, or like the action described in this way is either good or bad. So any other kind of synonymous pairings like these? There's good and bad, right and wrong. I have a few more in my own mind, but maybe you can throw a few out of your own. No? Well, let me know if you have something. Lawful or chaotic? Okay, Mark, I understand you're bringing in the topic of law. That's something that I wanted to hold off on for a minute, but just to give you a quick response. The idea of law is not exactly the same thing as ethics, although for the most part, we hope that they overlap a lot. The reason I'm saying that is because it's possible for there to be laws that are criticized on a moral basis. Sometimes people think that something which is permitted by the law is wrong. And in other cases, people think that something which is prohibited by the law is not wrong. So, but in general, yeah, I mean, in the absence of all law and order, there would be chaos, which is a bad thing. But ethics is not necessarily about preservation of order. It's rather about what's really right and wrong. Take, for example, while we're on the topic, Mark, the distinction between law and morality can be seen by pointing out examples of legal institutions that were still immoral. Can any of you guys mention or think of a practice or an institution that was at least at some time legal, but even when it was legal, I mean, we can tell it was wrong though. It was immoral. It was not a good thing, even if it was ever lawful or allowed under the law. Anybody have a guess as to maybe something like that? Something allowed at least at some time in history by the law, but it was wrong. Okay, slavery, yeah. So slavery was legal in our country and in many others for a while, in a long period of human history. But even when it was legal, it wasn't like something that was good for people to be doing. We rightly regard it as kind of a stain on our history, as something that was not morally enlightened. You know, treating people as property, selling children away from their parents, and then putting them into forced servitude and bondage without any rights or compensation, right? Public hangings. Well, yeah, concentration camps, certainly the Holocaust would be a clear example. If you had tried to free slaves during the time of slavery, like Harriet Tubman did, you could have been prosecuted under the Fugitive Slave Act, right? But that wasn't anything immoral that was being done there. Concentration camps. In Nazi Germany, if you had given safe harbor to Jewish people, like in the Anne Frank house, that could have been considered a crime. But certainly there's nothing immoral or wrong about that either. Janice, you bring up the insane asylums. Yeah, there's certainly been a lot of criticism of the previous status quo that existed in the earlier part of the 20th century, resigning people to insane asylums and then pretty much not giving them effective care or treatment. The Jim Crow laws, Brandon, you mentioned, the era of segregation and separate but equal that lasted for a long time after slavery was ended. Okay, so good, thank you guys. And even today, some people will say that we have laws on the books that don't reflect at least some moral perspectives that some people could have, right? Like take the pro-life people. Under our laws in the United States, since the Roe Wade decision, it was determined by the Supreme Court that there's a constitutionally protected right to secure a safe and legal abortion in all 50 states. But, you know, there's a lot of people who are very morally indignant about that and think, you know, that it's murder, that it's wrong, even if the law permits it. Some people are recreational drug users, take people that are smoking marijuana, whatever. Like a lot of people, maybe some of you, don't really think that that's immoral, like it's making you a bad, immoral, evil person. But of course, the law federally says that this is a crime. So we can't always determine the content of morality just by looking at the law. But I don't want you to take it in the opposite extreme either. Like for the most part, our laws do reflect our shared communal sense of what's right and wrong. And that's why we hold people accountable for violations of the law. But it's not like the law itself is a perfect reflection of moral ideals, because we're fallible human beings, and it's possible, of course, to institute bad laws. If there was no difference between morality and the law, then there would be no legitimate basis ever to engage in civil disobedience or to protest against the justifiability of certain laws. And of course, we all know that there is room for that, and there's room for moral criticism of the status quo. So that's why I would say when you think of morality, guys, it comes back full circle to your comment, Mark, about law as the point of morality. When you think about morality versus law, I think you should consider morality in the sense of the legislator who makes the law yourself, instead of the subject, the citizen who's just subject to the laws. If you're a legislator, like let's say a congressperson, and a bill came before you and it said, legalizing marijuana federally, yes or no, what is your vote? You then are the person who chooses whether it should be the law or not. And so when you think about morality, think about those type of deeper moral questions that would lead you to cast a wise vote, because the legislator, him or herself, cannot say how can I vote on this? I'll just vote however the law tells me to vote, because they're the lawmakers themselves. And so they make original decisions about whether it would be good or bad in a moral sense for these laws to exist in our system. Okay, so I'm just pointing out that there can be a difference between law and morality. Some things that are wrong are not illegal, and some things that are legal are wrong. But for the most part, we hope that law and morality dovetail and overlap with each other, with few exceptions. Okay, so anyway, back to this, right, wrong, good, bad. I don't think we had too many other, like you said, heaven and hell, that's kind of bringing it back to religion, but we don't necessarily imply or assume a pre-existing religious belief in a person just on the basis that they have a moral perspective, right? You can have secular people too that don't subscribe to the belief in the afterlife at all, but they would still have moral principles. So what about this? Moral as contrasted with, what's the opposite of that? Immoral. Sometimes when people talk about morality, they speak of justice. So we could also say just or justice versus injustice or unjust. And since morality is really a lot about how people behave and how they should act or shouldn't act, we can also put that here on this little board. How one ought versus how one ought not to act. Okay, so we probably could add further content to the list here, but in general, you're getting, I hope, the picture coming into view. With morality, we evaluate actions, practices, or institutions in either of these various ways. When you're judging something morally, you may look at the action and say, that was immoral, it was bad, it was wrong. Or on the other side, that was really moral, good, righteous, just. Having a sense of morality is really unique to the human condition. I mean, animals, for example, do not erect systems of criminal justice to hold each other accountable for violations against one another. It's just the law of nature out there and survival of the fittest. In human life, if someone has done something that violates some of your fundamental rights or harmed you or victimized you, then you have some legal recourse and there's some ability for the person to be held accountable and punished. So we're unique among all life forms in the way we have highly specialized and complex forms of accountability for people who violate or step outside of what we think are the moral norms. So we have to investigate and understand a little bit, what is the basis and the nature of morality? Now, a lot of you people probably, not just you guys, but me and everyone else, most of us probably grew up thinking that morality is totally subjective, that there's no objective facts about what's right or wrong, good or bad, moral or immoral. Probably you've thought that's just personal, that's subjective. You know, what I think is right and wrong could be different from the next person, and there's no answer to these questions. And that's a widespread view. That's called moral relativism, that morality is just relative to the person or maybe to the society, but it's not universal. That's what many people think. But the thing is that the philosophical writings of ethics that we've inherited from the past, the classic works of philosophy, in the mainstream, they seem to assume that morality is objective and that there can be a rational and objective basis for moral judgments and moral principles. So we are going to study actually two of the big moral theories that have ever been created in the West. A moral theory is an attempt to provide precise parameters that tell us when an action fits into either of these different categories. So what makes an action right or wrong? What makes an action moral or immoral? A moral theory will attempt to state answers to those questions. They will attempt to give us principles that will allow us to classify actions of either other people or of ourselves or of practices and institutions at large. So we're going to study these two main moral theories. There's more than two, but these I think are the two biggest rivals in the West as people consider what moral principles they should adopt. So we're going to learn two big moral theories, guys. And the first one is utilitarianism, a moral theory that is primarily given to us by a British philosopher of the 19th century, and his name was John Stuart Mill. So let's now start our lesson of utilitarian ethics. Now, I know this is a big word, but it says utilitarianism. Like utility is part of the root of the first half of the word. So you have util and then itarianism, okay, utilitarianism. This is a moral theory that's championed by this man. His name is John Stuart Mill. And he's one of the authors in our book. He's a British philosopher who lived from 1806 till 1873. So those are just the dates of his lifetime. And a little background on Mr. John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill was a philosopher and also a political economist. And he briefly served in the British Parliament in his life. So he was also a politician for a little while and a legislator. The Parliament, if you know, is the equivalent in Britain of the United States Congress. So he had a role as a lawmaker for a little while. But he's most widely known for his writings in philosophy. Nonetheless, he had an interesting mix of different views. On the one hand, he would be what we would call today a libertarian politically, meaning that he believed in limited government. He thought that the government should have the least power which is needed just to maintain social order, but no more than that. And so in his view, the state had no right to interfere in private conduct as long as the private conduct did not have harm for anybody else. So self-regarding acts that don't affect anyone else's interests, he would have said the law should tolerate people to do those things. So for example, the so-called victimless crimes, things like drug use, alcohol use, prostitution, gambling. He would say we should give people the freedom to make these decisions on their own because, you know, they're the best judge of their own well-being. And if they want to take risks with their health or wealth or whatever, then that's up to them and it doesn't affect anybody else's interests. So he would have been a libertarian in that sense, an advocate for small government, limited government, don't tread on me and that whole kind of thing. Like you don't want the government reaching into private behavior if it doesn't affect anybody else. But at the same time, he was also an advocate for a lot of progressive causes in his time. Like he was a person who thought slavery should be worldwide abolished. He was a very fierce advocate for women having the right to vote worldwide. So anyway, interesting man, John Stuart Mill. But his most lasting contribution, as I said, are his writings on the topic of utilitarian ethics. So let's understand first, what is the basic concept of utilitarianism? Here I'll write a definition, and we'll really expand on this, but here's the first taste of it. Utilitarianism says that the right thing to do morally is whichever action would create the greatest amount of overall happiness for the greatest number of people. So that's the rule of utilitarianism. Act always to promote the greatest amount of overall happiness for the greatest number of people. There we have the basic capsule definition of utilitarianism. This is what you would do if you wanted to follow the theory of utilitarianism and you wanted this to be your moral compass, right? Then whenever you do anything, you'd be thinking in this way. You'd be thinking, well, out of the options open to me, right, which one of these would be the one that would generate the most overall happiness for all affected? And whichever action that is, say I have 4 options, A, B, C, and D. And it's like, what do? I don't know which one. I want to do the right thing, but which one is right? Utilitarian ethics would advise you in this way. It would say, well, take stock of how much total happiness would be the result of each option. And whichever one would generate the maximum compared with the others, then that one is your moral obligation. And all these other actions aside from it would be wrong. Okay, so that's the basic concept of utilitarian ethics. Now, I want to, hopefully that's in your notes. Since it's important enough, I'm going to put it in the chat one time. Okay, so there's a definition in the chat. Here's something that we also want to know as we're learning about ethics. We're going to return to this definition and description of utilitarianism in a minute, but I just want to kind of make sure this is all clear. There are three main types of action in ethics. Okay. Okay, so some acts are classified as or labeled morally impermissible. And other acts are deemed morally permissible, so that's like the converse of this, the opposite. And finally, there are some acts known as or defined as morally obligatory. Okay, so here's my question then. Let's work through these definitions one time. And just using common sense, I'm betting that you can probably judge what it means to claim of an act that it's morally impermissible. What do you think that's saying, in other words? If an act is morally impermissible, what does that mean, you think? Even if it's just a wild guess. You know, looking at the language and the wording, maybe you can come up with the right idea. Morally impermissible what could that mean? Not permissible morally, meaning what? Okay, Brandon, something you generally should not do. Correct, yeah, so something that it's not okay to do. And to add to that a little bit, viewed as not allowed morally, yeah, so it's morally wrong and something that you should not do, so that's good. Let me put those points here and state it as a definition. Morally impermissible actions are actions that are morally wrong. So these are actions that are wrong and they're not okay to do. I add the second part, not okay to do, to kind of give you a little bit of a less formal way of thinking of it, because I think that's a common phrase. This is just stuff that's not okay. Not okay to do. Okay, now, there's going to be probably a lot of possible examples, but before we move on to the next topic here, what do you think could be some easy, clear examples of behavior actions that are morally impermissible? Something that probably we can all agree on, just obvious examples, if anything, of some morally impermissible conduct. Okay, Janice, just murder straight away. Yeah, definitely that's wrong. It's not okay at all to murder people. Murder meaning wrongful killing, so killing of people without cause, not for self-defense, not for judicial execution, not in context of war, but taking an innocent person's life from them for whatever malicious purpose. That's wrong, obviously. That's one of the highest levels of wrong. So morally impermissible actions can sometimes be along a scale, you know, in terms of how severe the wrong action is, and murder has got to be one of the worst. You have some other examples here. Stealing, okay, Naaman, yes. Stealing, taking property that doesn't belong to you without any valid transfer of ownership that's given by permission or through purchase. That's wrong, because you take away from another person something that they've invested their labor and wealth into, but they have every right to maintain their property. So, you know, that's a violation of morality, sure. Now, look, as a philosopher, I'm always trained to think of counterexamples to almost anything a person says. So like when someone says stealing, one part of my brain is like, oh, well, you know, it's possible, I guess, in theory, for a given case of stealing to be permitted morally. Like suppose someone's stealing to feed their starving child and it's really urgent. I'm not saying I would agree with this morally, but an argument could be made. So for the most part, overall, very marginal exceptions aside, I would tend to agree. Avoiding taxes, well, Brandon, that I would say is complex. I would say, yeah, I mean, for most of us, we all agree that you should pay your taxes because it funds public programs and, you know, the military and so forth that we all rely on in our everyday lives. But there are people, maybe you've heard of such people, like hardcore libertarians that say there shouldn't even be a state. We should just be living kind of off of our own weapons and on our own land, and, you know, we should disassemble this big nanny state where we have to pay taxes to things that we don't care about. Like, so there are some people that make moral arguments against taxation. You know, like there's a line of argument that exists there. But I would tend to agree. I mean, I think if you live in a well-functioning democratic republic, funding has to be ascertained for all of the various functions of government that serve the people. But anyway, I'm just trying to complexify a little bit, to give you a subtle sense of nuance, how the arguments can be constructed in some of these cases. Rape, that's a clear case, Mark, for sure. No one, I think, in their right mind could possibly say otherwise, that rape is not acceptable. You know, doing anything, assaulting another person, using violence against them, against their will, is wrong enough. But rape involving the sexual component, something that's so intimate and personal to a person, has got to be one of the most severe wrongs. Inflicting harm on someone, either physical or emotional, sure. There's also all manner of verbal abuse, harassment, and we're just scratching the surface, right? There's lying, there's going further along on the scale, there's genocide, you know, torture. So all of these things are fair game as examples. I just kind of wanted to start stimulating your thought about the topic by giving the concept and then thinking some examples out. Now, next we have morally permissible, okay? Morally permissible actions are just the reverse. So if morally impermissible things are things that are wrong and they're not okay to do, what do you believe would be a morally permissible act? Well, that's just the contrary. So that's an action or actions that are what? What do you think would be the definition below of morally permissible? So instead of saying actions that are wrong and they're not okay to do, morally permissible actions are claimed as what? Let's just see. Any guess? Okay, you could do, but not obligated. Well, fair enough. True. But on the moral sense, to add to that, Brandon, as Janice says just below, they are things that are considered morally not wrong. So not wrong, and they're okay to do. Actions that are not wrong. In other words, okay to do. Now, about my language here, not wrong. I noticed that someone said morally good. And I understand, because you could think that the opposite of wrong is good or right. But I prefer to have it more minimalist, not wrong, and here's why. Morally permissible actions, when you say, oh, they're actions that are good or right, that evokes thoughts of things which involve like noble self-sacrifice for some kind of important cause. Like if I gave blood or money or food to like a needy food blood drive or whatever, or food bank. And those are morally permissible, yes, that's totally okay, and there's nothing wrong with that. But there's also all kinds of little actions that don't necessarily have a big impact, and they don't necessarily promote anyone's benefit or anything, but they're also just not wrong. Like, for example, you see him wearing this black V-neck. That's okay, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's also not like important to the world, or it's not saving anyone's life or helping anybody, but it's not wrong, and no one can accuse me of doing something evil or immoral because I chose this outfit today. So morally permissible actions are anything under the sun that cannot be criticized as immoral. So sometimes they're just actions that don't have any major consequences, but they're also not wrong. Like, so if I want to take a walk around the block, that's morally permissible, but it's not an act of charity or anything. But if I do want to give to charity or something more involved that has a greater human benefit or whatever, then that's also morally permissible. So to make sure that we don't only think of the more noble and virtuous examples, I label it as not wrong. And so things that are okay to do. So let's go into this really fast. You gave me examples of morally impermissible actions. You gave some great examples. Let's ask, what could be some examples of morally permissible actions? And I would think that you can come up with these very easily, because I know you're a good moral person. And that means that just looking at your own life, almost 100% of it is going to be right here, right? So just think about anything. Community service, correct. That would be one fair case. No one will look at you, picking up litter off the street or helping kids in an after-school program and say, shame on you, this is evil and wrong. No, those are not wrong at all. So that's a good example. Community service, there's one example. Who else can toss out a few more? Just to kind of give us a well-rounded discussion, and then we'll move to the next. Petting a puppy. Okay, good. Sure, Janice. Nothing wrong with that. Although I got to say, in the days of COVID that we're in, some people don't really want you touching their pets anymore, which is kind of sad. So if it's your own puppy, no problem. And if it's not, I still think it's generally going to be accepted by most. But again, a trained philosopher will try to think of even one counterexample that's possible. So you know what I'm talking about. Some people will be like, don't touch my dog, blah, blah, blah. But I agree with you for the most part. Doing your homework, sure, Mark, no problem there. A person doing their homework is not doing a misdeed or some immoral behavior. It's hard for me to spin off a counterexample to your case here. Maybe if the person is studying to build bombs, and that's the point of their homework, then maybe that's not good homework. But for the most part, yeah, I can't imagine that's a real scenario. Playing Minecraft, sure, yeah, just entertaining yourself. I don't see these things, forms of amusement, as having any essential moral complaint. Although, I actually did just recently judge for the ethics bowl. This is a national high school ethics competition, so I was one of the judges. And one of the topics that the kids had to talk about, the high school team, was whether it's ethical to listen to K-pop, because a lot of the artists, I guess, are exploited and groomed from a very young age by these powerful marketing and entertainment industry agencies. And so, like, some of them commit suicide, some of them take on eating disorders, get plastic surgery. Anyway, it's kind of like a side point, but they were debating that actually, and some were saying, oh, it's wrong because if you engage in this media, if you consume it, then you're feeding into like a harmful status quo for those entertainers. But anyway, Minecraft has nothing to do with that. I was just kind of thinking about the possibility of something that entertains you being morally questionable. Like if you go to bullfights or something, I don't know, people might say that's wrong if they have a sense of animal rights or whatever. Opening the door for someone, sure, yeah. I don't think anyone can complain, although I don't think it's unprecedented for someone to say, I've got this, don't worry, you don't need to hold it for me. But it's certainly not a moral misdeed. Okay, good. So thank you guys for that. Now next, let's talk about morally obligatory. From the nature of the word itself, maybe you can guess or judge what that means. So morally obligatory actions, it's a little bit over and beyond even being permitted. What do you think it's meaning to say that an action is morally obligatory or obligated morally? What does that mean? Because we say these are things that are wrong and you shouldn't do them. And these things are okay, they're not wrong, and you can do them. What would morally obligatory then be, perhaps, the definition? Okay, yeah, so these are things that you have to do. Yeah, that's the right way to put it, Naaman. These are actions that you must do, and it'd be wrong not to do them. Okay, so actions that you must do morally. And in other words, they are wrong not to do. So obligation refers to it being a duty, something you're obligated to do. So these are actions that are like morally mandatory, morally required. You can think of morally permissible actions as they're allowed, but these are mandatory. So not every permissible action is obligatory, but every obligatory action is at least permissible because you can't be obligated to do something wrong. So like I told you earlier, I'm wearing this black V-neck, and that's morally permissible. Is it morally obligatory, though, for me to wear the black V-neck? No. It's not like I must wear this or I'm doing something wrong. If I had worn a different color or a different fit, whatever, that would be fine as well. So this is permissible, but it's not obligatory. Well, what can you give as an example, perhaps, of a morally obligatory action? And, fair notice, it's perhaps a little harder at first to think of such examples, I find, than the other two, but let's try. If anybody thinks they have something, if you don't, then I'll help you out. But okay, Naaman, taking care of your kids, sure. Like, for example, you've had children and you've willfully taken custody of the children. The only exception I can think to your case, Naaman, is like suppose that someone wanted to put their children up for adoption, biological children, and they had no intention ever of maintaining their custody. But other than that, right, you've taken the kids home and they are yours. So at that point, we don't think, oh, you're permitted to feed them and clothe them and give them housing. You're obligated to do that, and that would be a direct violation of your duty as a parent to your offspring. So that's one good case. Wearing clothing in public, well, I don't know, is it Justin? Because there are nudist colonies, and there are people who say that it's actually wrong, the whole status quo of forcing people to wear clothes. There are beaches where some people can be nude in public. So, I mean, for the most part, we have a norm and a cultural standard. But if you go to like indigenous places around the world, sometimes these tribal cultures, it's normal for no one to wear clothes or to just wear like a couple of small things, but all your private parts are still exposed. So I'm just trying to give you some complicated feedback so that you can see how that's maybe not a universal moral standard to all. Providing for children, okay, good. In today's day, wearing a mask, yeah, I mean, I would think it is a moral obligation in a sense, because if you don't, then you are more capable of transmitting the virus around, even if you don't know that you have it, maybe because you're not symptomatic. But of course, you know, there are people, I don't know, that think that their freedom to take risks or something are being abridged by policies that mandate the masks. But I mean, I find that to be a weak argument, so I would agree. Rights. Well, Jason, the word rights by itself is a little under-specific, but if you mean like the non-violation of rights, that makes sense. Going to work if you have a job, well, I don't know. I mean, first of all, I don't think you have a moral obligation to have a job itself, but given that you have one, I think it's a duty of your employment, but if you don't want to even work there, you're free at any point to quit at will. So I'm not so sure I would follow this one, you know, because you're morally permitted to take leave of absence, to decide no longer to work there. But you do, I think, have some sense of obligation to your fellow coworkers not to leave them hanging and stuff. So that's a little complicated. But anyway, guys, good. Let me give you some other examples too. Suppose that you make a promise, right? Well, when you make a promise, you generate a moral obligation to keep the promise, whatever it was. If you don't want to be obligated to do that thing, then you shouldn't promise to do it, right? So like say I promise someone that I'll give them a ride back from the airport and they're going to be arriving on Saturday at noon. And they say to me, I can count on you, right? I say, oh, for sure. Don't worry. I promise you. I understand you don't have a ride. You don't want to take a lift. So I'll help you out. Just make sure to be ready. And I'll be there at Saturday at noon at the gate. Now, suppose that Saturday noon is there, time's passing, 12:30 passes, it's already 1. So the person calls them up and says, hey, what's up? Are you hitting traffic or did you forget? Because remember, you promised you're going to get me from the airport today at 12 and it's now 1. And imagine they say, oh yeah, I know I promised that, but I was never going to come through. The whole thing is, I just think it's funny that you're stranded. You're a loser. Haha, you trusted me. Hang up. Now, if you do that, that's immoral. You know, that's a violation of a promise that you made. And here's another way we can see the difference between law and morality, right? Because although that's immoral and it violates a moral obligation that you created by promising, is it a crime? It's not a crime. It's not like the person can say, well, I'm going to file a police report on you then. So I hope you enjoy your Saturday because you're going to have to talk to the cops now. That's not a crime, right? It's a violation of a private promise. It's not a contract that could be enforced under the law. So sometimes people can do things that are wrong that don't rise to the level of crime. That's just one case. Moral obligations. If you make wedding vows, another example. I don't know if that's always backed by any kind of legal guarantees, but if you say, I swear to love, honor, and obey this person and remain faithful till death do us part, and then you cheat on them, that's a violation of a moral obligation, but in many cases, in most states, it's not a legal violation either. So promises generate moral obligations. And Brandon, I like your comment there. I wanted to come back to that. You're morally obligated to not perform the morally impermissible actions. So there is a logical relationship between this category and this one. For example, we say it's morally impermissible, some of you said, to murder. Yeah, it is morally impermissible. So that means that you have a moral obligation to not murder, right? So like you're obligated morally not to do any of these things. And likewise, not performing your moral obligations is impermissible. So if you have a moral obligation to care for your children, then it's morally impermissible to not do that. If you have a moral obligation to keep promises that you make, then it's morally impermissible to break them, okay? So now we've kind of learned a little bit about some basic terminology that's relevant to ethics. I talked to you guys about how ethics is the study of morality and moral concepts, and we listed out a couple of binary contrasting moral concepts like good, bad, right, wrong, moral, and immoral. Now I told you about the 3 main types of action in ethics and given some examples. So let us return then again to our main focus, which is utilitarian ethics. Before I erase it completely, utilitarian ethics and other ethical theories try to inform us as to what makes an action count as one of these three kinds. Every action that you do is a member of one of these three categories. It's either something that you may do morally and it's not wrong, or it's something that you have to do morally and it'll be wrong not to, or it's actually a wrong action. So the next step is to try and see how utilitarianism advises us as to which actions are morally obligatory. Okay, so you already see in the chat, and I wrote it on the board previously, that utilitarian ethics is based on this principle, that you should always do the action that leads to the greatest amount of overall happiness for the greatest number of people. So just one more time, because I think it's good to have it on the board visually. Utilitarianism, act always to promote the greatest amount of happiness overall for the greatest number of people. Utilitarianism is a member of a family of theories which are called consequentialist ethical theories. So let me also tell you about what consequentialism means. Consequentialism. Consequentialism says that the morality of an action is defined by its consequences, okay? Okay, so consequentialism is a consequence-based ethical framework. And utilitarianism is one member of the consequentialist family, okay? So try to understand this analogy. I'm Richard Vulich. My family name is Vulich, and I'm the Richard member of the Vulich family, right? In the same way, utilitarianism is a member of the consequentialism family, but there are other siblings that it has that are slightly different that are still consequentialist, okay? What the different consequentialist theories have in common is that they all base morality on consequences. Now, what are consequences? Consequences are the results or the effects that come from what you do. Every action has some number of consequences, whether they are large or small and insignificant. Again, consequences are just things that occur because of what somebody does as a consequence, as a result. So like, imagine this little stick figure is a person like you or me, and they do an action, right? Here's an arrow. The arrow stands for time. After committing the action, sometime later, consequences occur. And so I'm drawing the letter C and kind of highlighting it with those dashes around. These consequences are what determine whether the action was right, wrong, or whatever. So if you're a consequentialist, you always are trying to anticipate in advance what will be the results of my actions. And if these are going to be good consequences, then the action's good. And if these are going to be bad consequences, then the action is bad. But the consequences to the utilitarian brand of consequentialism that really matter are those as they bear on overall human happiness. So to a utilitarian, when you're acting and taking decisions, you should try your best to take whichever action that's going to cause the greatest overall happiness for the greatest number of people. And those are the consequences that you should be focused on and trying to create. Now, I've got more to say to expand on the utilitarian philosophy for you guys. So we say that it says, act always to promote the greatest amount of overall happiness for the greatest number of people. This concept is reinforced by a principle that John Stuart Mill argues for, which is called the greatest happiness principle. So the greatest happiness principle is just kind of like a a leg of support that props up and justifies the utilitarian theory. So here's what it says: greatest happiness principle. Okay, so the greatest happiness principle is this statement. It says that actions are right to the extent that they promote happiness, and actions are wrong to the extent that they promote the reverse of happiness. So let me put that here. Actions are right to the extent that, to the degree that, insofar as they promote happiness. And actions are wrong, on the other hand, to the extent that they do the opposite, to the extent that they promote the reverse of happiness. Okay, so that's the greatest happiness principle. Once again, actions are right to the degree that they promote happiness, and they're wrong to the degree that they promote the reverse. So this language of to the extent that, all that means is that this is a matter of degree, that there are basically levels to this. So if you do an action that creates or produces some happiness, that's good, but the more happiness that the action creates, then the better. Like, for example, suppose that someone is like a skilled surgeon, and they perform a complex surgical procedure on a child, saving the child's life that otherwise would have died at that young age. By saving the child's life, they preserve all of the future happiness that otherwise would have been eliminated and destroyed by their death at that young age. So like them later on graduating college, getting married, watching their kids grow up and having grandkids and having a retirement, traveling the world, creating a business, I don't know, whatever things that lie out in the future that you hope to experience, that you are motivated to get going in your life. If a person dies that young, they don't experience any of that. So the child's life being saved is a very good thing because it provides for all of the future happiness that they otherwise wouldn't have had. It would have been canceled otherwise if they had died. That's just one life. If the same surgeon saves 5, 10, 100, 1,000 lives over their career, this just contributes to an even stronger and better moral record. So it's like taking an action that creates happiness is good, and the more of it, then the more and more good it is, right? So it's kind of like there's levels to this. Not to worry, Ivan, I see you there. Thanks for being at the meeting. We all just do our best. I totally understand the internet outages and complexities of trying to be present all the time, but just do your best. So anyway, on the other side of the divide here, an action that produces the reverse of happiness, like pain, misery, whatever, is a bad thing. So say that somebody killed a person, right? This is like the opposite of saving a life. In the case I just mentioned, the surgeon saved a child's life. Well, suppose that someone kills a child, for example. If they did that, then they would completely erase all the future pleasure and experience that the child otherwise would have experienced later on. So that takes all that happiness and joy out of the world that would have still existed. And that's a bad thing. Now, killing one person, it's one of the worst things that anyone could ever do. But imagine that someone killed 5, 10, 20, 100, go all the way up to like a horrifying historic figure like Hitler killing millions. That's making the moral record worse and worse and worse. It's actions that are worse and worse, the more of this reverse of happiness that is established because of what you do. So he thinks the greatest happiness principle is just intuitive and immediately obvious to us because each of us pursues happiness for ourselves and seeks to avoid the reverse. So if we're doing that for our own sake, then why wouldn't doing it in general for all be the right principle to live by morally? So that's the greatest happiness principle. Actions are right to the extent they promote happiness. Actions are wrong to the extent they promote the reverse. Now we have to actually ask another quick question or gain a little bit more insight about the word happiness. How is this word happiness being interpreted and understood by utilitarian theorists? Well, many of you probably think happiness, it's so hard to define. It's just one thing for one person and it's something else for someone else. Utilitarian theory does, in fact, think that we can give a precise and clear definition of what happiness is. So to utilitarians, happiness is really none other than pleasure and the absence of pain. Okay, so that's, when you hear happiness, think of that, pleasure with no pain. So here we go, happiness, what is it? It is pleasure and the absence of pain. Just to create a little more room here, I'm going to just erase this part, and to the left here, GHP stands for greatest happiness principle, which this is. Okay, so happiness, pleasure, and the absence of pain. So if that's how the theory defines happiness, then what would be reverse of happiness? You can actually, I think, deduce this from the definition given above. If happiness is pleasure and the absence of pain, then the reverse of happiness would be what and what? Can anybody come up with that? Pleasure and the absence of pain equals happiness. So the reverse of this would be, and I'm giving you a little hint, something and something. Similar wording to the definition above, but kind of switcheroo, switching things around. So like, what do you think is the definition I'm hinting at for a reverse of happiness? Let's see if anyone could throw that in the chat. Good, very much so. Correct, Brandon. Pain and the absence of pleasure. That's the reverse. Pain and the absence of pleasure. So who, do we look to as examples of good moral people that we want to sort of emulate? Very good, everyone. I see that you got the right intuition, so that's great. When you go out in the world and you do actions that create pleasure for people or take their pain away, then that's a good thing because the people want pleasure and they don't want pain. On the other hand, though, if you go out into the world and you cause pain, that's what you're doing, or you're taking pleasure away from people, well, that's bad because people want the pleasure and they don't want pain. So this greatest happiness principle just expands on that. Of course, according to the principle, you would want to create more pleasure than less. You'd want to remove more pain rather than less. And you'd try your best not to do the opposite of actually imposing pain on people and removing their pleasure. And so the more pleasure created, the better the action. The more pain created, the worse the action. And the more pain taken away, the better the action, or the more pleasure taken away, the morally worse the action is. Okay, so why is it that happiness and pleasure is so essential to being a good person in the theory of utilitarianism? One more little piece of evidence is given by the author Mill to justify that position, that happiness and pleasure is the standard of morality. Too much of a good thing can be bad, you say, Brandon? Well, perhaps, but I guess to a utilitarian here, let me try and channel John Stuart Mill from the grave. He would tell you this: well, if it becomes bad, then it's because it stops producing pleasure. So like, say that a person, is doing a lot of drugs I'm just trying to freestyle off your example. Say a person taking a lot of drugs because the drugs make them feel good. But if they get too far gone into it, then they start becoming a hopeless addict and they start having health problems, and now they're not as happy. So there's always some way of finessing the description of a person who's gone too far with a good thing to say that, in fact, there's no longer pleasure being given by the source that used to please them, So like a person travels the world all the time, like jet setting, looking for new experiences, hunting for like some kind of festive environment to be in. And after a while, they're like, but is this all there is? I'm starting to lose the plot. Like, I've traveled everywhere, I've done everything, and I feel unfulfilled. Sometimes even very successful, highly successful people in positions like that will commit suicide, and all kinds of things can happen. At that point, though, they're no longer happy, right? They're not pleased, despite the experiences that they are having. So I think he would hold fast to his assertion that if it's not pleasurable to you, then it's a bad thing. And if you pursue something that used to be pleasurable and you kind of exhaust the source of pleasure from all of its content, then you either should move on to something else or, find a different way to find pleasure. But anyway, I take your point, though. I'm not saying you're wrong. It's just to be kind of in line with what Mill might say, I would offer you that as a little thing to think about. But okay, very good. So I said that there's one more principle that is stated by John Stuart Mill to try and further reinforce the idea that pleasure is the good and promoting it to the maximum is what you ought to do. He says it's intuitive and obvious because of this idea that happiness, or since he used pleasure and happiness interchangeably, I'll just put slash happiness slash pleasure, basically same, is the only thing that we human beings pursue as a end and not as a means. Okay, so if you're wondering, why is happiness and pleasure receiving all of this emphasis in the theory? Is that really the right standard to reach for if you want to live a good moral life? Mill would give you this answer. He would say, well, yeah, it is, because happiness and pleasure is the one and only thing that we pursue, that we seek as an end and not as a means. And since that is true, he says, we already kind of recognize through our own behavior that happiness is what we each pursue. You know, we're all individually in the pursuit of our own personal happiness. But I want us to understand this statement in very good detail. So that means let's focus on these words for a moment, end and means, and understand what those mean. Now, these words are perhaps somewhat familiar to you, but we want to kind of focus on them for a moment specifically. To understand the meaning of these two words, ends and means, I think I'll ask you to consider a phrase, a saying that is somewhat well known to a lot of people. Maybe some of you have ever heard this statement that the ends justify the means. Sometimes people say that, the ends justify the means. So who knows or has a sense of what does that statement actually mean? If you could, like, you know, your little kid sibling, if you had one, comes up to you and says, ends justify the means. I read this in a book. What's that mean? Now you're the adult, and you're going to tell them. What would you say? Or what do you think that statement refers to? You have a sense of that? The ends justify the means? In other words, what's that mean? And then when you give me the answer, that'll help us expand on these points. So what does it mean when a person claims that the ends justify the means? What are they saying? Just kind of break it down and say it in other words. Okay, Mark, so no matter what you had to do to get there, the goal you are trying to reach is worth it. That's a good way to put it, yeah. And also, Justin, the goal justifies the sacrifice. Very good suggestions already. So let me follow up with another question then. If we say that the ends justify the means is basically the same as saying the goal justifies the sacrifice, or the goal you're trying to reach makes it worth it, what you had to do, then tell me in other words, what is the end? What does the word end refer to by definition? Ends, then, are in other words, what kind of things? I think you've already kind of said it in your own way, but let's repeat. Ends are none other than what? To say that I'm pursuing an end and that ends justify means, the end part of that statement refers to what thing? The goal, right, exactly, goals. Alessandra, you say results, yes, but one thing to add, they're desired results, so they're like objectives, right? Results could just be what happens, but a goal is what you want to have happen. So ends are just goals and objectives. Ends justify the means sometimes, and that means that the goal justifies, well, you tell me then. What are means then in relation to ends? If the end is the goal that you're going for, then what are the means with respect to that end? The means is by definition what stuff? Means are the process. Okay, good, Janice. The methods, the actions that you take to get to the goals, right? So means are just actions taken or methods used to achieve the goals, the ends. Okay, actions taken and methods used to achieve one's goals. or ends? Okay, hopefully you can read that, but what it says there is means. The actions taken or methods used to achieve one's goals. Okay, so like then when someone says the ends justify the means, now we can very clearly say what this means in general. It says that if you have a goal and the goal is important or valuable enough, then getting to that goal makes justifiable, or it makes it okay whatever you might have had to do to get there. A lot of times people say something like this when they had to do something a little questionable to get to a very important goal. Like maybe the person had to lie to somebody in order to win a competition or to get to a result they were seeking. And they feel a little bad about the lie, but they're like, well, you know, I lied, but I had to do that to protect people's well-being. And so in that case, the goal of their safety justifies the means. The ends justify the means in that case. Or suppose that I, committed theft, but I did it in order to buy a PlayStation 5 or something. Then you might say, well, I care so much about the PS5 that goal justifies the means. I mean, that would not be okay, though, but just as an example. So now anyway, coming back to this principle, what it says is this: happiness or pleasure is the only thing that we people pursue as a goal and not as a stepping stone towards a goal. In other words, happiness is the only thing that we are all out here looking for and seeking after. Everything else that you want in life, aside from happiness alone, is just something that you want as a means to the real goal of becoming happy. All right? And so if that doesn't exactly come through intuitively, immediately, I'll try and make it seem pretty intuitive by asking you to think through this set of questions, okay? So even right now, you're in the pursuit of a goal by watching this lecture, because you can't be watching it for no reason. I know that you're watching it at least for certain reasons. So let's just start with that, since I know that's what you're doing right now. In watching this lecture, that is a means to what end? I mean, why are you doing this? Like, what goal do you have? This lecture attendance will serve you in what way? Will be a means to what end, if anything? Well, it will be a means to some ends, but like, what do you say? You don't have to be too like, wise sounding or anything. Just passing the class. Okay, good. So let's take it slow and steady. You take this lecture as a means to doing well in the class, because attendance at the lecture better prepares you for your performance in the class overall. Okay? So taking this lecture and attending these meetings is a means to a good grade in the class, and that's an end. But the grade that you can get in this class, say you get a good grade because you attended, even getting a good grade in this class is not the last thing that you want to do in life. It's not like that is your only ambition and goal. It's not like when you get an A in this class, if you do, you're just going to be there like, oh, I'm done. I mean, that was all I wanted in life. No, even getting an A in this class is a means to a yet further goal. So why do you want to pass this and your other classes with good grades? That's a means to something else. Sebastian, I appreciate what you've said to learn about philosophy, because it can be an end in itself. But many of us are thinking with a little bit more of a bigger picture of our own individual lives in mind. So you want to pass the class, but passing the class is just a means to what else? And I think some have said it above. Janice, you mentioned that by passing such classes as this, you'll then successfully attain your degree, right? Now we're a stage further, but why do you want the degree? It's not like that's your last goal either. Like, you're just going to hold the diploma and then you're going to be like, man, life is over. This was the only thing I really ever wanted. So now I did it and I'm done. No, you want to get the degree, but that is a means to even further goals. So starting at the beginning, you attend a class as a means to a good grade, and you want the good grade as a means to your graduation, and you want the graduation and degree as a means to getting a career. Okay, good, Janice. But we're still not done, because why do you want to have a career? You just like the idea of work? That's what you want to do in life? You like the idea of labor? No, you do want a career, but you only want it really as a means to even further things. So the career that you're seeking out by doing all these things would be a means to what end? What's the goal behind getting a career? Why do you want a career? You can tell me that. Jerry, you kind of maybe hinting towards that direction, but I still want to see if anyone could put it in their own way. Like, what's the reason for wanting a career? It's a means to what goal? What do you think? You're going to work for free? Like, why are you going to work? Well, one step in between the happiness, though, Brandon. I was going to hold off on that for just one more step, because basically you want to get the job or career in order for you to get income. You guys are getting money. I mean, come on, you're doing it for money. I'm not teaching you guys for free either. So you'll do it, but you'll do it in order to have wealth and income. And we're almost at the end, okay? Why do you want to collect this wealth? Why do you want to have income and wealth? Well, that is because it's a means to what? To the purchasing power for goods and services and financial stability. Now, why do you want to be financially successful, Jerry? Why do you want to be financially successful? Why do you want to have purchasing power for goods and services and to have financial security? What's the reason you want to have the ability to buy things? There's only one more thing you can really say, but let's get to it before we close. So, like walking through the steps, you take a class as a stepping stone towards a good grade. You want the good grade as a stepping stone towards your graduation. And you want to graduate as a way towards getting career placement. And then you want to get that career so that you can take in income. And you want the income because the income is a means for the purchasing power of goods and services. And why do you want to be able to purchase goods and services and to have spare money? Because you'll be happy, right? Because you think that will make you pleased. And so the thing is, but Angel, you still got to understand, set yourself up for a successful life. What is success? What is a successful life? It's a happy life, right? So you wouldn't be doing all this stuff if you thought it wasn't going to make you happy in the end. There's no reason for you to attend school if you didn't think that you're going to benefit from it, right? So you believe that you're going to benefit, and that's why you're going through all these steps. You're seeking, in the end, your personal happiness. You're pursuing your happiness through the wealth that you could achieve, through the job that you could get, through the career that would lead to the job and the wealth, etc. Keep in mind, money is just a made-up thing. I mean, of course, we all seek it and we want it. And we want to have the ability to buy things. But in the state of nature, just Homo sapiens, 100,000 years ago, there's no monetary system. So we've invented these structures in order for us to have an orderly system of transfer in a marketplace. Purchasing, selling things, and not just having to barter objects like, in generations before we actually had currency. But the reason that you want to become the wealthiest person that you could possibly be is because you think it'll make you happy. I bet you if you thought that wealth would make you miserable, then you wouldn't care so much about getting it, right? Or if you thought financial security and the ability to buy things wouldn't make you happy, then why would you care to do it? You're doing it because you definitely think it will make you happy. And if I have one more question, why do you want happiness? That's when it's okay to just shrug your shoulders and be like, what? I don't know, because because happiness is everything, right? And that's why Mill says that if you think about it, everything you do is directed towards your own happiness and the pursuit of happiness. Not all of us find happiness in the exact same ways, right? Some people might find happiness going skydiving, bungee jumping, thrill seeking. Another person, like maybe me, would find that traumatizing and totally terrifying experience. It would be in no way pleasurable. But that doesn't mean that these two types of people don't seek happiness. They just find happiness in different sources. So what's universal and common to everybody is the pursuit of happiness. If it seems like everything you do, from getting up out of bed to all the things in between, from day to night, are just in the pursuit of your ultimate happiness, then why wouldn't making happiness the standard of morality be the right principle to use in establishing a moral theory? Okay, so there's a little more still to say about Mill, and that's why we're going to have 2 meetings on him. We'll continue on and finish up his material on Thursday. So I just want you to definitely read John Stuart Mill's essay on utilitarianism if you haven't read it yet. And we're just getting into it today. We're setting up the theory, and we have like a couple of details to finish with on Thursday. But as a sort of review and summary of today's meeting, here's the basic idea. We've started studying ethics. Ethics is the theoretical study of morality and moral concepts. Moral concepts include concepts like good and bad, right and wrong, moral and immoral, just and unjust, how you should or should not act. There are 3 main kinds of action in ethics. There's actions that are claimed as morally impermissible, morally permissible, or morally obligatory. And it's impermissible if it's wrong, it's permissible if it's not wrong, and it's obligatory if it's mandated or required morally. The theory of utilitarian ethics tells us that an act is morally obligatory if it's the action that would generate the most overall happiness for the greatest number of people. And it says always act so that you promote the greatest amount of total happiness for the greatest number of people. Oh yeah, about turning in the paper, you will email me your paper to my email address. Here it is. It's in the syllabus too, but just putting it in the chat one time so that it's very clear. Yeah, no worries. rvulich@fullerton.edu. You see my email address there. Just going to compose an email to me. You have to type in the address and make sure you spell it correctly, and then just attach your email document of your essay. It could be a Word file, PDF, Google Doc. I generally prefer Word and PDF, but I can open any of the different format, including Pages. I just don't want it to be something that has restricted access where I don't have the ability to just click it and open it right away. So you email me the essay. There's no such thing as Canvas. And Titanium is not an email delivery system either. So just have to send me an email, create an email. That's all. It's not due until next Thursday, March 4th. So you still have some time. But last closing thoughts, right? Utilitarian ethics says that you should act always. It is Thursday, March 4th, Ivan. So you'll see that also noted in the announcement that I sent to class last week with the prompt in it. So you still have 9 more days. No worries about that for now. But as the week goes on, you probably don't want to wait until the very last minute. It's always a good idea in a philosophy class not to cram and do things at the last minute, because this material is complex and subtle. And I find that it's much easier when you give yourself the time and space to write it in a way where you're calm and composed and at leisure, and not in the middle of the night right before. But students sometimes have tough schedules or whatever, procrastinate a little. I'm just offering that as advice. Utilitarian ethics says act always to promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. It's a member of the consequentialist school of thought, which says that the consequences are what matters for the morality of an action. But the consequences in particular that matter to utilitarians are those as they bear on overall human happiness. And happiness is sort of underlined as the key feature to focus on, because he says that actions are right to the extent that they promote happiness, and actions are wrong to the extent that they promote the reverse. Happiness is equal to pleasure in the absence of pain. And the reverse of that is pain in the absence of pleasure. And then one more point that we added now was that happiness is focused on so much because it seems that it is the only thing that we pursue as an end and not as a means. Everything else in life, whether it's relationships, whether it's money, whether it's experiences, travel, possessions, they are desired because of the happiness that you think you will get from having them, the pleasure that you think you will get from having them. But if you ask why you want happiness, that's just sort of a brute fact. We want happiness just because that's the human condition, and probably the condition of all living things. So if the pursuit of individual happiness is what your supreme overarching goal of life is, then making more of it rather than less in total for all affected is the right principle to live by, he thinks, morally. So we'll finish more of this on Thursday, I guess. But for now, I appreciate all you guys' attendance, and thanks so much for being here. Sorry for the one troll that's sort of tried to jump into our meeting a little earlier. That is a very rare thing, but once in a while with the web tools that we use, that kind of thing can happen. You guys have heard of Zoom bombing and stuff. Well, that's even worse, I find, because if someone finds access to a Zoom meeting and then they can hijack it by using the camera and microphone, at least in this case, the worst thing that can happen is someone putting funny comments over there. But because I'm very tech savvy, I have the same stream that's running on my 5G phone right here. So it's like, as soon as I see a bad comment, I can block the person immediately, and then they don't have the ability to write anything on my channel anymore. So that's something important to know, right? Don't ever anybody think that you can assume a different username and then come troll the meeting. I know you guys wouldn't do that, but maybe like a former student or a current student could. If they did that, though, they would get blocked from the channel, and then they couldn't comment anymore. So, I mean, I know that you would not do that, some random internet troll, but they're blocked, so they can't do anything anymore. Okay, guys, well, have a great one. Take it easy, and I'll see you back on Thursday. And if you do need anything, you can email me anytime. So are we all good? Just closing out and signing off. Just want to see if you guys heard me, and we're good to go. Okay, guys, thanks again. Have a great one, and I'll see you then on Thursday. Okay, bye-bye.